Thank you all for joining our final session of our 2021 Briscoe Night of Artists Collector Summit. I'm Emily Wilson, the Curator of Art, and joined tonight by colleagues, our Executive Director, Michael Duchemin, Education Manager, Ryan Badger, who is running the show for us, and Shannon Segovia, our Collector's Concierge. Tonight, this session delves into the seminal question, why collect Western art? Will be filled with a robust discussion between our moderator and two panelists, followed by a Q&A session at the close, which everyone is invited to participate in through the chat function on Zoom. So just whenever a question comes into your head, type it into the chat function, and at the close, Michael Clawson, our moderator, will queue those questions up and ask them to our panelists. So as I mentioned, our moderator tonight is Michael Clawson. Michael is an award-winning journalist, photographer, and editor who has devoted his entire career to telling stories related to the arts, including the performing arts, music, film, and for the last 7 years, American fine art. A native Phoenician, he's worked for newspapers and magazines all around Arizona, as well as several national publications. He is currently the executive editor of Western Art Collector and Native American Art magazine. He lives in the Phoenix area with his wife and 3 children, including 2-year-old twins. Our first panelist today is Jim Parks, who is the board member and former board chair of the Audrey Museum of the American West in Los Angeles. Jim began his career in public accounting, he's still practicing that, with a specialty in real estate and entertainment industry, representing individuals and providing services to corporate clients, including MGM, ABC, 20th Century Fox. Jim also started a successful real estate company and for 9 years was CEO and chairman of a publicly traded television and motion picture post-production company, which won 6 Emmys. He's also on the board of trustees of Whittier College and the board of advisors of the Marshall School of Business at University of Southern California. His collecting habit began in the 1970s with mid-19th century antique firearms and Native American beadwork. He started seriously collecting paintings of the American West in the early 1990s. Over the years, Jim has loaned artworks from his collection to many museums, including the Autry, the Cody Museum, the Phoenix Art Museum, and the New Mexico Museum of Art. His collection was featured in Western Art Collectors magazine in June of 2012. And our second panelist today is Western American art historian and author, Dr. Len Peterson, who is chair of the C.M. Russell Museum Board of Directors and the 2019 Montana Heritage Guardian Award recipient, the highest honor bestowed by the Montana Historical Society Board of Trustees in Helena. His newest book, The American West Reimagined, Gems for the Coeur d'Alene Art Auction, which you can kind of maybe see here, apologies for that, has just been released. And this landmark publication delves into the artwork and artists of the American West and of the Coeur d'Alene auction in particular. Dr. Peterson's distinguished biographies include Charles M. Russell Legacy, Charles M. Russell Photographing a Legend, a biography in words and pictures, Philip R. Goodwin, America's Sporting and Wildlife Artist, L.A. Huffman, Photographer of the American West, Call of the Mountains, the artist of Glacier National Park, John Ferry, artist of Glacier National Park, and Blackfeet John L. Cutipus Clark, America's Wood Sculptor. In his year-end Best of the West Collector's Edition, the iconic True West magazine rated Dr. Peterson 2018 Best Author for his American Trinity, Jefferson, Custer, and the Spirit of the West, is the best nonfiction book of the year. It is a highly regarded book, and the editor and reviewer, Stuart Rosenbrook, wrote, "The end result of Peterson's introspective journey as an author, scientist, and Westerner is his publication of the most reflective philosophical history of the American history published in the past 50 years. An avid collector of Western art, Dr. Peterson is also a recipient of the C.M. Russell Heritage Award, the Western Heritage Award, the Scribe Award, the High Plains Book Award, the Will Rogers Gold Medallion Award, and the University of Nebraska Great Plains Book of the Month selection. So I leave you in these gentlemen's capable hands, and I'm sure we'll have a great discussion. Have at it, Michael.
Emily, thank you. And Michael Duchemin, thank you for having us here at this panel. I'm really excited to be here. Jim and Larry, welcome. I'm excited to chat with both of you about Western art and how it is that you've gotten to the position where you have. Let's start with a real simple question. How has collecting art been and viewing artwork been during the last year, during a pandemic and a shutdown and everything else. Has it been difficult to view and participate in the market?
Is this, how do you want to go? You want me
Oh,
to?
Jim, why don't you answer that?
Jim, why don't Jim, we'll go to you first, and then Larry, will go to you. Jim, what's it been like?
Well, it's awkward, but I'd have to say the art market has been pretty robust during the pandemic. The art auctions of Western art have done well. Some of the museum shows that have been done remotely are, were kind of a learning curve. And so people learned during this process. I don't think they were as successful as live shows, but as time passed, people got used to dealing with the technology and could actually attend the shows remotely. But overall, I'd say it was a pretty good year for Western art sales and Western art purchases, and there was a lot of opportunity to acquire great works of art.
Excellent. And Larry, what about you? Have you noticed anything over the last year?
Well, I'd agree with what Jim said. I think at the first it was a tough time. A lot of auctions, as you well know, got delayed, rescheduled. And I think it was a learning curve. But as we all got more comfortable getting introduced to Zoom auctions, I think it improved. And really a lot of the galleries innovated and started putting on videos and other supporting documents to help them sell art. I think it's a real turnaround. I'd agree with Jim. I think the auction world for Western art is very robust. March in Montana in Great Falls had like 750 lots in the first session of the like 300 or 400 had all sales. No, all of them sold, and only 7 in the entire auction of 750. It was like a 99% sales rate. So I think as we hopefully come out of the pandemic, that we'll see even a more robust kind of pin-up demand for Western art. So I'm very positive on what's happening in the Western art world.
Well, excellent. Yeah, I've certainly seen some interesting things over the past year. Here we are on a Zoom call. I'm sure none of us are. This is not strange to us anymore, doing this by video. So it's definitely interesting. Over the next hour, I think we definitely want to talk about, as a collector, kind of coming into the market as a new collector, and then kind of going up the ranks to where you guys are both at now. But in the meantime, let's ask the question that Emily asked at the top of the hour here. Why Western art? Jim, let's start with you. What initially drew you to Western art, and why did you start collecting it? Why did your interest focus on this genre?
Well, what drew me to it was, the history of the American West and the artist's interpretation of the American West. So it was really my interest in America, my interest in Western, the American West, and then the people that were part of the American West. And so the artist's interpretation of that resonated with me. And, so I had an affinity for the West starting right out of the box as a collector, although I view collecting Western art as just collecting American art that happens to be centered around the geography of the United States that's in the West. But all the Western artists I collect, I think, are great artists. They're great American artists. And the subject matter happens to be the West, which resonates with me.
Larry, before we go to you, Jim, real quick, do you remember the first piece of art that you purchased? Do you remember your first big, maybe not even big, your first purchase?
Well, this will be interesting because my first good size canvas that I purchased was a Fritz shoulder, which was certainly, and he was living at the time. And I started collecting as a branch of collecting guns and Native American beadwork. I started collecting Fritz shoulders, and Fritz was living then. So I viewed him as he was an entertaining artist on top of it. And then I continued to collect Fritz shoulders, and I decided in the 90s that I was going to really branch into Taoist founders. So I sold all my Fritz shoulders with a few exceptions and started going into Taoist founders. So the really first Taoist founder I bought were two. I bought a burning house and a Kaus. And, I sat there and contemplated buying those two paintings for hours before I actually pulled the trigger. I don't do that anymore. It's amazing how, as you collect, you're a lot easier to pull the trigger on big purchases.
And Larry, what about you? Why Western art? And do you have any fond memories of early purchases?
Well, for me, Western art is the love for the American West in solid form, just like Jim said. I think if you don't have a love for the American West in all its forms, whether it's cowboys, Indians, wildlife, landscapes, I don't think you'll have a love for Western art, but they go together. I grew up in a really small town in Montana, right on the Canadian-North Dakota border, and my dad had a hardware store, and he sold Charlie Russell prints. And so from an early age, I fell in love with those Charlie Russell prints. And of course, if you're in the Northern Plains, he's like the god up there, as Michael and Emily well know. And so I think it went from there. But my first painting that I remember of any note was buying a Edgar Paxson called Seeking the White Man's Book, which I actually used on the front of my American Trinity book. And I still have it. But definitely collecting trends, as Jim says. I think our tastes change over time, and our interest in different artists change over time.
As anyone who's coming up in this genre, in this category of Western art, they see it right away, and it's exciting because the market is somewhat small compared to American art in general, and there's a sort of a cooperation, a friendship amongst all the dealers and the museum curators. It's an exciting place to be. For anyone who's thinking about jumping in, maybe one of you have what's a way to step into this Western art? Not just purchasing art, but being involved in the community of Western art. Do you have any insight on that? And Larry, let's start with you on this one.
Well, I think it's really important, because the last thing you want to do is have someone that gets excited about Western art and then having them make purchases that they regret or feel like they weren't treated correctly. So in anything you do, especially collecting, knowledge is king. And so what you need to do is, when you're starting out, is you need to have a good local museum like the Autry or the Briscoe or the Russell Museum. You need to get involved with that. You need to be a subscriber to Western Art Collector, so you can see a lot of art. I think you should be on a service like askart.com, so you can put in a list of your favorite artists, and you get notified when their art comes up for sale. Need to go to art galleries, and there's a lot of wonderful art dealers all over the West. And I think all of those will make you knowledgeable. And I see the pitfall that happens for a lot of people, and we all do it to begin with. We get excited and probably buy pieces that we shouldn't have purchased, and we spend a lot of years trying to unload that. But my biggest concern is if people aren't knowledgeable, that they're going to make a lot of mistakes. And then I'll plug my book. You need to have a standard reference book on Western American art. And I think The American West Reimagined is going to be the standard textbook on Western American art for a long time, because nothing like it's going to come out again, just because it was a collection of art that was really at the peak of Western art collecting, right up until 2008, when the stock market blew. the amount of great art that came out from the late 90s up until 2008 has not been repeated, and the prices, a lot of the deceased artists have never recovered from that period.
And Jim, any tips for new collectors wanting to get involved in the community?
Well, I agree with Larry. You need to start going to museums. You need to get yourself educated. Start interfacing with gallery owners as well. And during the process of, going to museums that have Western art collections and interfacing with gallery owners, you're going to meet other collectors, which is part of the enjoyment of collecting Western art, is having others who are also interested and enthusiastic about that genre and show an interest. So, I mean, the first thing is get educated. Second thing is start meeting other people that are collectors so that you can get some knowledge with collectors that have been doing it longer. Next, develop a good eye. Recognize, if you're going to collect a particular artist, recognize what that artist's best work looks like. And certainly Larry commented on the fact that up to 2008, you had some great works come on the market. And then he mentioned the Lehman Brothers crash that happened in 2008, which actually, created a price retraction on a lot of work that still hasn't recovered. But you're finding that there's still an opportunity from time to time to acquire an artist's great work of art at a price that is more affordable today than it was 12 years ago. And so, there are still paintings coming out at auction or privately that are just killer and deserve to be in any collector's collection.
I think following up with Jim too, his good point is, I think when you are going to buy a piece of art from an artist, you need to buy the best piece you can get your hands on. And two mediocre pieces for the same price as one great piece, you'll get burned on the mediocre. It's kind of like real estate. It's the prime property that weathers the storms, and that's true even after 2008. The really great art from the great artists holds up a lot better than mediocre art from mediocre artists. So you got to be careful.
Well, yeah, Larry is, clearly, if you buy a mediocre painting, it will never be anything but a mediocre painting, and there, you'll find that there is no market for that. I mean, part of being a collector is buy the best, do your homework so you know what the best is. When something comes up that's the best, stretch to get it. Don't be
Exactly.
shy and saying, well, this is, I can't afford it right now. If you can get the best, get the best. And sometimes the best comes up when you're not in necessarily the best spot to acquire, but I found that stretching sometimes pays off.
Yeah.
One thing we hear a lot from collectors is they want to know who's a bankable star, whose paintings are going to be worth more in 5 years, in 15 years, in 20 years than they are when they're buying it. And of course, that's the $1 million question. But what tips do you have to the young collectors so they don't make any purchases they may regret? Sounds like one of the things you're saying is look for that quality. Don't buy two pieces when you can, pool your money and buy one big one, one better one. But are there any other tips that you might have to young collectors who are interested?
Well, you're also mentioning, who's the artist that's going to have staying power. And, if you pick great artists there and who will continue to evolve artistically, you have a high probability that you're going to end up with an artist in your collection that's going to have staying power, could appreciate, have and you'll have lasting enjoyment. And you know, and certainly over the years, I've met many living artists who, just because I enjoyed their personality, I would buy the best work they have. But they've ultimately turned out, you know, and we've all got examples of living artists who have matured as artists, and you know, are viewed as icons now in Western art. You know, typical example would be Howard Turpney, who's not very active at all anymore, but you know, his works have continued to have staying power and demand.
I would totally agree with Jim, and plug for the book again. We've got a whole part on Howard Turpney. I think 20 of his masterpieces in the book. I think one of the things that I think is important is an artist who you can see their painting from 10 feet and you know who they are. You know, I can look at a lot of deceased artists and contemporary artists, and they have something that differentiates them from so many other paintings of Western art. I mean, there are literally, I bet, 10,000 Western art painters. And you can go in some galleries and I can't tell who they are. You know, you can look at a Turpney and say, that's a Turpney, or a Russell, Remington, Schreibvogel, Frank Tenney Johnson. You can tell those people from 10 feet away. And I think there's something about their look that I think has staying power, versus just artists that go into photorealism, taking photography, shooting pictures, and then painting it, and they all look the same to me. And so I think that's important.
Yeah, I think you're what I talk about is looking for a painting that actually has the artist's soul as part of it.
Yeah. You can see their soul in their paint brush lines, their strokes. Exactly. That's well put.
Both of you are involved with museums, you know, the Autry and the Russell. Let's talk for a minute about what, you know, collectors can do, just art enthusiasts can do to support the museums, but also the shows that those museums host, whether it's the Masters at the Autry or the Russell at the C.M. Russell Museum in Great Falls. In what ways can people get involved with these museums and really like be a force, you know, and participate in the market in a really unique way? Larry, let's start with you. In what ways, you know, you've risen up through the ranks of the C.M. Russell Museum. What opportunities are out there for collectors to be involved in the marketplace and in the category of Western art at the sort of the museum level?
Well, I think all museums, when they put on shows of any substance, love to have volunteers to begin with, and there's many opportunities in that respect. I think you can help out the museums by just becoming members and attending, you know, these auctions at the Autry or the Russell, and I think that's a way of getting involved in the auctions, and it gives you time to see a lot of different artists, and it gives you an opportunity to kind of hone your skills. It really is a great way to get in and learn about the artists. You know, a lot of artists are regional. I remember when I first started doing my books and going to auctions in the Northern Plains, I thought I knew every art collector in the country. And then I gave talks for about 4 or 5 years in a row at the Prix de West at the National Cowboy and Western Heritage Museum. I didn't know one person at those shows. It was like a big eye opener. So I think, you know, with a museum that's close to your region, I think there's all sorts of opportunities to get involved with them.
I mean, I'd echo that. I mean, basically, if you have an interest in the history of the American West and the art that goes with it, get yourself involved with the museum and start. I don't know what happened here.
I think they're showing pictures of the Russell, probably the Autry there, Jim.
Okay, so basically become a member of the museum and attend the events that the museum is sponsoring. That is, that is the way to start the process. So I agree with you, Larry.
I think another thing that's positive that's come out of the last year is a lot of people say, well, I'm 500 miles from the Autry or the Russell or the Briscoe, but with the advancement of websites with content, video contents and podcasts and stuff on the website, you can participate anywhere in the world with that museum. So the distance has been annihilated by technology. And so I think that is a real positive and a real, I think, feeling for hope for all museums, that they can reach out to people and they don't have to drive to the museum to be part of the museum experience.
That's correct.
And it's worth mentioning the Russell is in August this year. It's coming up. It's normally in March. It's going to be in August, and looks like it's going to be a great show. I've been hearing some things from the museum. It sounds exciting. And Jim, for you, the Masters, the sale was just 10 days ago.
Correct.
Were you happy with the involvement?
By the way, we still have a few paintings for sale that are great.
Oh, excellent. Yeah, everyone should check out the Autry. They have some really spectacular.
But we did the show remotely, and I think we had real good success with it. So we had pretty good sales figures the day of the event, and we've still got, like as I said, a number of paintings and sculpture that are really good and are still available. And the show is continuing to be exhibited. The good thing about Los Angeles is on April 1st, while the museum show is still up for the Masters, we're now able to open the museum so people can come in and visit the last part of the show before we have to take it down. So we had the experience of doing it remotely, and we've still got a live show for people to view. And then, in the next few weeks.
Excellent. And we were talking about supporting the museums. What a great opportunity. The museums certainly need it this year over any other year. The Russell, the Autry, and the Briscoe. If you like these museums, if you enjoy what they do, definitely consider joining as a member. And there's other opportunities, I'm sure, for anyone who wants to support these great institutions with amazing collections. And just look at we're doing a Zoom thing here for the Briscoe. Their programming is amazing, so definitely worth considering if you're on the fence on that. I'd love to, going back to Western art more generally, do either one of you, and Larry, let's go to you first on this. Do you see any trends in Western, and sort of a side question to that, is Western art generational?
Well, I think the classic increase in interest in Western art really occurred in the 1950s. And during the 50s, that's where a number of Western art museums opened up. And that includes the Russell Museum and a lot of other ones. And that generation, like Jim and my generation, people that are older, they grew up in the 50s on cowboy movies and Westerns, and that they were iconic. Now, after Vietnam and after 1969, when Western movies kind of went the way of Western art for a while, the 69 was Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, The Wild Bunch. John Wayne finally got an Academy Award for Best Acting for True Grit. Midnight Cowboy came out. It wasn't actually a cowboy movie, but Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid was the last Western to be the top grossing movie of the year. And so I think it is somewhat generational, but while that generation of the 50s got excited about cowboys and Indians, there's all sorts of things to get excited about with new generations, and especially as we include more women and people of color. I think the appeal is going to be just as good as before. So I'm very optimistic, because really as John Ford said, the main character in the Western is the landscape. And that's true really with most Western art. Even if you purchase portraits, like a Sharp portrait or something, when you look at a portrait of an Indian or a cowboy, you still imagine the landscape. You still imagine them being out in the desert or the mountains. And the landscape's always going to be there. And it's a big part of Western history and Western art. And it really defines it from art that's east of the Mississippi River.
So to add to that, I would say that it is generational, and really what interests a generation in a particular period, particular time, and then a particular genre of revolving around it is having an interest in the history. And so, there's been, you need to have generational interest in the history of America and the history of America, of the American West. And so what caused people to be so interested in the West in the 1950s and 60s had to do with popular culture. And that popular culture interest has to continue to today. And so, the West continues to be a place that evolves and changes and new things happen. And so part of the interest in the art of the American West is also have the history of the American West and to be interested in the history today. And so part of this is an educational process that needs to be continued so that younger Americans continue to be interested in the place that they live and the community that they're involved in.
Larry, when you're talking about, the time period of the 50s and 60s, and Jim, you kind of brought this up a little bit too. My thoughts immediately went to something that Seth Hopkins has said before on numerous occasions. He's mentioned the movie Toy Story, the animated film Toy Story, how that is a story of how the West was replaced by science fiction. Kids of the 1960s put their cowboy toys away and started playing with space toys. And I don't know if that's true or not, but I have always remembered Seth saying that that's how Westerns kind of went away. As soon as Neil Armstrong put his foot on the moon, it was we were in space at that point. So I don't know if there's any truth to that, but it was an interesting idea.
Well, it's my position that that all Star Trek is wagon train in outer space. So you just have to latch onto that.
Yeah, I like that though. I like that too. We're talking about new artists, younger artists. Do you see hope in the future for Western art, particularly with some of the younger artists who are coming up? And I'd love to hear your favorites. If there's anybody that you're looking at, anyone you're watching. Jim, if you don't mind, let's start with you.
Well, I think there's definitely some young artists coming up, and certainly in the Autry Master Show, we're trying to feature younger artists. Logan, and I always mispronounce his last name. Haji, I think is a fantastic artist, and continues to evolve as an artist. Mark Majori, I think, is a great young and up and coming artist who's kind of embraced the West. They both have kind of different style that's different than the more traditional looking Western paintings that evolved at the turn of the 1900s, the turn of the century back then. Their palettes are different. So I think they've got a great opportunity to continue to evolve as artists, and they're already doing quite well. So there's two examples, and they should continue to be watched. And the key here is to see how do they evolve as an artist.
I call it marinate. Let time let them marinate, or see
Yes.
how they develop, And I would agree with what Jim said. And I'm no expert on contemporary artists. I know a lot of them, and I follow them, but I'm not. I am more interested in the history of the deceased artists, because I love the culture and the context as much as the art of the 1800s, the Romantic period, Manifest Destiny, social Darwinism, and all these things and how they affected the artists. My favorite period's, 1880 to 1930 or something. So I would just defer to Jim on that point.
Well, in reality, my favorite period is 1900 to 1945.
Well, there you go.
But the fact that you still have artists interpreting the American West in the manner that they're interpreting it now is interesting and dynamic, and it's ultimately part of the art history of America. And so I think it's wonderful to see new artists emerge and have success in interpreting in the West in their manner. And that's why we still have, we'll continue to have Western art shows, and we'll continue to have interest in American West, because it continues to be organic and continues to change.
And Larry, you're saying that you don't follow the contemporary artists too much, but you certainly follow the historic work. Do you see younger collectors, maybe just different generations of collectors, who are embracing sort of the Russells and the Remingtons and other historic artists? Are you seeing them mostly sort of in relation to the Coeur d'Alene art auction coming in for those younger artists?
Well, I think so. I think there are younger buyers, and there's a lot of people at the Coeur d'Alene Art Auction and Scottsdale and all the other ones that I don't know. They're new to the genre, and they're excited about it, and they're avidly collecting deceased art, just for the same reason Jim and I like that period pre-1900 to whenever, 1930 or 1945. So I think there's always going to be an interest in that art, and I think it will continue. I know I've listened to lots of podcasts, and I think we've talked about it, and a lot of people are very pessimistic about what's going to happen. But I think they're going to be wrong, and I think it's, in some ways, as our society tends to fragment more, I think a lot of people are going to kind of grab tightly to things that have some meaning and give us an anchor in the storm. And I think Western art does that.
Yeah.
Oh, go ahead, Jim. Go ahead.
One of the issues when you're starting to deal with collecting deceased artists like Remington and Russell is there's just not that many left that you can buy and have it become part of your own collection. And because of the scarcity that exists with quality deceased artists, there's always going to be a demand for the work because of the scarcity. As younger artists mature, somebody who's interested in a Russell is going to be interested, if they're interested in that particular type of style, they're going to be interested in a younger artist that also might paint in that way, but interpreting it in their own fashion so that they have their own style. They're not just copying Russell. And, so that's what's kind of interesting, is somebody that's influenced by Russell, but it's not copying Russell. And that is the opportunity to acquire something today, because the scarcity of Russells and Remington are such that you can't add them to your collection.
I think that's a good point. Byron Price called the generation after Russell the sons of Charlie Russell, the Cowboy Artists of America, and I did a wonderful book on them. And I think that's true. I think for a lot of younger artists, these artists like Russell Remington, that painted tightly, but you're a Taos artist, Santa Fe artist. I mean, Delano, looks, a lot of his art looks like a lot of the art that people are doing today. Victor Higgins, modernist. So, even the Kouses, there's a lot of the artists, Burninghouse and Phillips and all these Taos artists. A lot of them a lot of it was quite impressionistic. And so I think there's a great variety even in the deceased artists. They all didn't paint like Russell and Remington. And I think almost every artist, and I profile 120 deceased artists, I think almost everyone in there, I can open that page and say, that's a Delano, that's a Frank Tenney Johnson, that's a Paxson, Remington, Russell, Schreibvogel. You can go down the line. Again, I mentioned it, but the contemporary artists that Jim mentioned, those are two you can see from the 10 feet away too and tell who they are. So if they try copy the deceased artists too closely, and tens of thousands of artists have done that, it's not going to work.
It's a lot more interesting to see a new artist who might be influenced by a Maynard Dixon or a Victor Higgins or a Hennings. They're influenced, but they're not copied. And so they're effectively created their own style, that there's a familiarity with what they're doing, but it's totally different.
And so many of the deceased artists, like the Taos artists, a lot of them trained in Paris and Dusseldorf and Munich. So they got inspired by the art in Europe, the Chicago Art Institute and others. But they came out of it with their own style, and that's why they end up in a book today where there's probably thousands of them back then that we will never hear from again because they didn't find their own style, and they're not remembered today.
It is remarkable to see, and I get all the auction catalogs and flipping through, and so many artists that you know right away who they are and their career and where they were and what they were doing. And then there's these other artists that they were just a blip on the radar for a very short time, but they made amazing artwork, and now it's selling for $2,000 and $3,000 at these auction houses. And there's so many great artists out there. I'd love to know, and I'm going to ask the question, but before you answer, I'm going to just check in with our participants. But my question is, are there any other artists? Are there any artists in history of the 18th or 19th or 20th century that just didn't get the break that they deserved? Anyone that you were researching in your book, Larry, that maybe is due for a breakout, sort of at auctions or at a museum somewhere? I'd love to know if there's anyone that we should maybe be keeping our eyes on that's maybe due for some sort of comeback. And while you think about that, any of our viewers, definitely get your questions in. We're going to start wrapping up here soon, but I want to make sure that everyone has an opportunity to ask a question. I do see there's one hand up from Alan, but he's a call-in, and I'm not sure how to take that question from Alan. So if anyone has any questions, be sure to just type them into the chat there, and we'll get to them. And in the meantime, Larry, back to my question. Anyone that is due for a comeback?
Well, that's a great question. And boy, there's a lot of artists that I actually put in the book that aren't very well known today, but were, members of the National Academy of Design and famous. It's funny how some people really famous in the 1800s, but no one knows about them today, like Gilbert Gall. I mean, his stuff doesn't come up that much, but he was a big deal in the 1800s. I think Frank Hoffman is a good example of someone who had he had impressionistic paintings. He had tight paintings of sporting art, hunting. He was an incredible artist, and he's colorful, like the colors that were used in a lot of the Taos paintings. And so I think he's someone that is underappreciated. And I mentioned that in the book. I think of anybody in that book, I think he's the most underappreciated. I think Laverne Nelson Black, in my part on the New Mexico artists, actually put him on the front page of it, because the painting there is so beautiful, and it has all the colors of the Southwest that make their paintings so distinct.
Well, I think one of the things you're talking about, artists that had a certain amount of recognition during their lifetime and then went into obscurity. And part of, if you're a great artist and you've gone into obscurity, part of it is somebody's not marketing your work today. And so so if somebody has to take that on to bring that artist out of obscurity and put them into the mainstream again. And so if you look at paintings that seem to be done magnificently and have their own unique style, and the artist is somewhat in obscurity, that might be an opportunity to buy an artist at a good price point, and then ultimately through some collective marketing, bring that artist back into the main fold. Larry's bringing up Laverne Nelson Black. I've never viewed Laverne Nelson Black as being an obscure artist, but
compared to the others, I would say.
I think Laverne Nelson Black is a quite a talented artist, and everyone who wants a Western art collection should have one or two or three. And Hoffman is a great artist. Neither one of them is as obscure as some other artists that you'll see that are deceased, and their work has gone into obscurity. And the key here is recognize it yourself. Recognize that this is a great painting, purchase it, and then see what you can do to bring that artist out of obscurity.
I think those are great points, Jim. And I'd also point out what really helps a lot of obscure artists, since I do art books, is to have someone write a book on them. For example, Philip R. Goodwin, who Russell loved more than anybody, before I wrote the Philip R. Goodwin book, his paintings sold for 10, 15, 20,000. Now one sold for over 300,000, and they're actively collected. And a real point we haven't talked about is the emergence of illustration art becoming so hot. A lot of the illustrators, I have a whole thing on illustration art, N.C. Wyeth and Goodwin and all the rest of them. And that has really emerged as a really collectible area that has been quite reasonable to buy, not N.C. Wyeth, but some of these other illustrators, Frank Stick and Schoonover and Corner and all those guys. Their stuff, I think, is still reasonably priced, and they're great artists. But for so many years, Norman Rockwell, which I have a great Rockwell in there, they were just disparaged by the elites on the East Coast. And so they were made fun of. And as I point out in my book, Rockwell's getting his dues because his Saying Grace went for $46 million a few years ago, and it's probably the highest priced artist in my book of all of these. So, he's right up there with Moran and Bierstadt and some of the rest.
And part of that, so Rockwell did go through a period where he was not appreciated. And part of it was getting some pretty high profile collectors suddenly saying, well, I'm interested in collecting Norman Rockwell, and bringing them forward into the mainstream today. And so again, it's recognizing somebody that's got great artistic talent. Rockwell actually has great heritage associated with it. So it's a great story. He wasn't hard to bring into the mainstream again because he was never really left. I can think of a couple of artists that are pretty good that are completely forgotten. And
before we get too far ahead of ourselves here, we do have two questions I wanted to get to. And this one is for you, Jim. You mentioned Fritz Scholder. Has the Institute of American Indian Arts, the IAIA, influenced Western art at all?
Well, yes. because clearly there's two artists that are viewed as quite important out of the IAIA, which is Fritz Scholder and T.C. Cannon. And Fritz Scholder, when he died, he went into obscurity a little bit. He's actually getting to be rediscovered. He's very abstract and modernist in a look. It is somewhat representational, but it's, the palette is quite modern and the interpretation is quite abstract. And Fritz Scholder's, when he died, Fritz Scholder's major canvases could be acquired, for $50,000-$60,000, and now those same major canvases are going for $250,000. So that he's coming back. And and again with T.C. Cannon, there's a man who died in 1978. Limited body of work, many museum shows on his work, and if you can get a T.C. Cannon, they're in high demand, and those are all situations where the IAIA created artists that had an impact on American Western art.
I agree with that. Up in Northern Plains, I think Kevin Red Star went there, and I think Hauser went there too. So they have graduated a lot of outstanding artists for sure.
Yeah, I was kind of focused on dead artists out of the IAIA.
Oh, okay.
but Kevin Red Star is definitely quite popular.
Yeah.
And producing to this day is in the Autry show.
Good.
Another question from our audience today is, this is a good one, and I'm going to let whoever wants to take this first. Can you explain the collecting philosophy of an established premier museum like the Gilcrease and that of a museum like the Briscoe? And I guess more broadly or more generally, how do museums tend to differ in their collecting philosophies as far as what goes in the collection and what they gear their audience, what they gear the museum toward? Can you, either one of you, speak to that?
Well, both of us can. Who would you like to
Jim,
go first?
Jim, you go first.
Well, all museums have stories that they want to tell. And so the Autry is a history museum that uses art as part of the way of telling those stories. And so the collections of the Autry are really about advancing the stories of the American West, so it can be interpreted through a variety of different mediums, both in physical artifacts, paintings, and lectures, effectively talking about the American West from the past to the present. So our collecting efforts revolve around those stories we want to tell. And so each museum has a particular thing they wish to focus, and then they collect accordingly.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. The incredibly well-established museums like the Autry and the Russell and the Gilcrease. The Gilcrease has, I think, more pieces of art and historical matter than any other Western art museum by a long ways. I think as far as the Russell, I can speak for the Russell Museum, I think we like to acquire a lot of regional artists, whether they're deceased or contemporary. We've acquired a number of contemporary artists in and around Montana regionally. All museums in general, their art acquisition funds often aren't that big, and a lot of museums rely on folks donating art. And I think that's another way you have to groom, people like Jim at the Autry and to get involved, and then hopefully the influential patrons will give some of their precious art to their favorite museums. So I think it's getting a membership base and patrons who really buy into a museum are important. And I think that's how a lot of museums acquire some of their best art.
I mean, the Gilcrease actually has been, yeah, every once in a while they deaccession
Right.
one of their paintings because they're actually interested in kind of expanding the scope of their American art collection and their collection of the American West. So they'll, you know, you'll go to the Gilcrease and they have some of the best, and it's really a, you know, the foundation of the Gilcrease is Gilcrease himself and his collecting habits that he enjoyed, you know, and so the Gilcrease is, I can see that they're kind of expanding a little bit more into their modernist interpretation of the American West. So they're buying painters that are a little more abstract than what they initially started with. And that's probably a direction of their collection, although I don't really have much involvement with the Gilcrease other than I like to go there and see what they got.
Yeah, I will say that I think modernism, maybe the sort of mid period between the 30s and the 60s, is probably more affordable and less that I see in Western art museums, not as a robust area of collection. That is probably something that Briscoe I'd like to get into, start sort of amassing that period, because it's underrepresented in what I've seen in a lot of Western art museums. But I will end at the session for tonight, and I want to thank Michael Clawson as our moderator, Jim Parks and Dr. Len Peterson for joining us as our panelists. Thank you so much. It's just been a wealth of wisdom learning from you both and having your opinions. And for everyone on the call, you know, we hope to see you here at the Briscoe this next Saturday, and or follow along if you're going to be online. And thank you all for joining us tonight, and we really appreciate your time spent here.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Stay
both.
safe.
Yeah, stay safe.